The businessman walking down Pine Street didn't even slow down when he saw the kid sitting on the sidewalk with a guitar case open for change. Just another street musician trying to make a few dollars, he thought. Probably can't even play. It was October 1966 in Seattle, and 23-year-old Jimi Hendrix looked exactly like what most people expected from someone busking for coins. His clothes were worn and mismatched, his shoes had holes in them, his hair was wild and unkempt. Everything about him screamed poverty and desperation. What the passing crowds didn't know was that the beat-up guitar sitting in the window of Ray's pawn shop behind him, the one with the $20 price tag that might as well have been $2,000 for all the money Jimi had, was about to become the instrument that would change rock and roll forever. And the 3 chords that Jimi was about to play on that guitar would create a sound that no one had ever heard before, a sound that would influence every guitarist who came after him, a sound that would prove that musical revolution doesn't require expensive equipment or formal training. Sometimes it just requires someone desperate enough to find magic in whatever instrument they can get their hands on. This is the story of the afternoon when rock and roll discovered its future in the hands of someone that society had written off as just another street kid with a guitar. Jimi had been living rough for weeks. He'd come back to Seattle after a disastrous stint in Nashville, where he'd been fired from every backing band he joined for being too wild and too loud. His last $20 had gone for a bus ticket home, and now he was trying to make enough money busking to afford a meal and a place to sleep. But the guitar he'd been using, a cheap acoustic that he'd borrowed from a friend, had finally given up. The neck had warped beyond playability, and 2 of the strings had snapped with no money to replace them. For 3 days, he'd been walking past Ray's pawn shop, staring at the electric guitar in the window. It wasn't much to look at, a beaten-up Stratocaster copy with scratches on the body and tarnished hardware. But it was electric, it had 6 working strings, and at $20, it was the cheapest guitar in the shop. It was also completely out of reach. Jimi had managed to collect $7.50 in 3 days of busking with a broken guitar. At this rate, it would take him 2 weeks to afford the pawn shop guitar, and he'd starve long before then. That's when inspiration struck. Ray Kowalski, the pawn shop owner, was a gruff man who'd seen every sob story and hard luck case that Seattle had to offer. But there was something about the young black musician who kept staring at the guitar in his window that made him curious. When Jimi walked into the shop that October afternoon, Ray was ready to tell him the guitar wasn't for sale on credit. He'd heard that pitch 1,000 times. Instead, Jimi made a different offer. "I've got $750 cash, but I want to make you a deal. Let me play that guitar for 15 minutes. If I can't make it sound better than anything you've ever heard in this shop, I'll leave and never bother you again. But if I can blow your mind with it, you let me take it for the $750, and I'll come back every week to pay you $2 until it's paid off." Ray almost laughed. He'd owned the pawn shop for 15 years, and he'd heard every musician in Seattle play at one time or another. The idea that some street kid could play anything he hadn't heard before seemed ridiculous. But something about Jimi's confidence intrigued him. 15 minutes, Ray said. "But I warn you, kid, I've heard it all. And if you're wasting my time, I'm calling the cops to move you away from my storefront." Jimi nodded, and Ray pulled the guitar from the window. The moment Jimi plugged it into the small amplifier Ray kept in the shop, something changed in the air. Even before he played a note, there was an electricity that seemed to flow between Jimi and the instrument. Then Jimi played the first chord. It was E major, the most basic chord in rock and roll,
But somehow, the way Jimi played it, the way he bent the strings and used feedback from the amplifier, it didn't sound like any E major chord that Ray had ever heard. The second chord was A major. Again, a basic chord that any beginning guitarist learns in their first lesson. But when Jimi played it, it seemed to contain entire melodies within itself. The third chord was B major. Simple, fundamental. 3 chords that form the foundation of thousands of rock songs. But what Jimi did with those 3 chords changed everything. He didn't just play them in sequence, he made them talk to each other. He used the sustain and distortion of the electric guitar to create sounds that seemed impossible. He made the guitar weep, scream, and sing in ways that Ray had never imagined were possible. Other customers in the pawn shop stopped what they were doing and moved closer to hear what was happening. Then people on the street began to notice. The sound coming from Ray's pawn shop was unlike anything they'd heard before. Within minutes, there was a small crowd gathered outside the window, trying to see who was creating the incredible music. Jimi played for exactly 15 minutes, using only those same 3 basic chords. But in those 15 minutes, he created a sonic landscape that contained blues, rock, jazz, and sounds that didn't have names yet. When he finally stopped playing, the pawn shop was completely silent. Ray looked at the guitar, then at Jimi, then at the crowd of people who had gathered outside his shop. "Take the guitar," he said quietly. "Forget the payments, just take it." Jimi replied, "I can't do that. A deal's a deal. I'll pay you back." "Kid, I've been selling instruments for 15 years, and I've never heard anything like what just happened. That guitar has been sitting in my window for 6 months, and nobody wanted it. You just made it sound like it was worth $1,000. The $750 is fine. Consider the rest a gift to the future of music." What happened next would become legendary among Seattle musicians. Jimi took the guitar and walked outside to his usual busking spot. But now, instead of a broken acoustic that could barely hold a tune, he had an electric guitar that responded to his every touch like a living thing. The crowd that had gathered at the pawn shop followed him outside, and when Jimi began to play, still using just those same 3 basic chords, something magical happened. The small crowd became a large crowd. People started calling their friends. Musicians who happened to be in the area came running to see what was causing the commotion. For 2 hours, Jimi played variations on those 3 chords, and never once did it sound repetitive or boring. Each repetition revealed new possibilities, new sounds, new ways of expressing emotion through electricity and strings. By the end of the afternoon, Jimi had collected more money than he'd made in the previous 2 weeks combined. But more importantly, he had discovered something that would change his life and the history of rock music. He had found his voice. The sound that came from that $20 pawn shop guitar in Jimi's hands would become the template for everything he would record over the next 4 years. The feedback, the distortion, the way he bent strings and used the electric guitar as both a rhythm and lead instrument, it all started that afternoon on Pine Street. Word of the street performance spread through Seattle's music community like wildfire. By evening, musicians who had dismissed Jimi as just another struggling player were calling around, trying to find out who the guitarist was and how they could hear him play again. 3 days later, Chaz Chandler, former bassist for the Animals, happened to be in Seattle scouting for new talent. He heard about the street musician who was creating a sensation with an old pawn shop guitar, and he went to investigate. What Chaz heard convinced him that he had found the musician he'd been searching for. Within a week, he had convinced Jimi to come with him to London, where they would form the Jimi Hendrix Experience and change the course of popular music. But it all started with 3 chords on a $20 guitar that most people wouldn't have looked at twice. The guitar itself became famous in its own right. After Jimi became internationally known, Ray Kowalski would tell the story of the afternoon when a street musician had transformed his cheap pawn-shop guitar into an instrument of genius. Musicians would come from around the world to see the shop where Jimi had first revealed his electric guitar magic. Ray kept a plaque on the wall that read, "Where Jimi Hendrix proved that talent doesn't require expensive equipment, October 1966. But perhaps more importantly, Jimi's performance that day demonstrated something that would influence generations of guitarists, that innovation comes not from having the most expensive gear, but from having the vision to hear possibilities that others miss. The three chords that Jimi played that afternoon, E, A, and B major, became the foundation for some of the most famous songs in rock history. Purple Haze, Hey Joe, and dozens of other Hendrix classics would build upon the sonic discoveries he made with those basic chords on that beat-up pawn-shop guitar. Guitar teachers around the world now use that story to encourage their students. They tell them about the day when the future of rock and roll was discovered not in an expensive studio or with a custom-made instrument, but on a street corner with a $20 guitar that nobody else wanted. Guitar students learn that Jimi's genius wasn't in knowing more chords than other guitarists. It was in understanding how to make the chords he knew express emotions and create sounds that no one had imagined were possible.
The businessman who had walked past Jimi that day without slowing down later heard Purple Haze on the radio and realized he had witnessed musical history in the making. He became one of many people who learned that day not to judge a musician by their appearance or circumstances, because sometimes the future of an entire art form is sitting on a sidewalk with a guitar case open for change, waiting for someone to recognize that genius can come in any package and speak through any instrument. The $20 pawn-shop guitar taught the world that musical revolution doesn't require a fortune in equipment. It requires vision, passion, and the ability to find magic in whatever tools life puts in front of you. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, it requires just 3 chords and the imagination to hear everything they can become. If this story of finding greatness in humble circumstances moved you, hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Share it with someone who thinks they need expensive equipment to make great music. Have you ever witnessed someone create magic with simple tools? Tell us about it in the comments. And don't forget to hit that notification bell for more stories about how genius can emerge from the most unexpected places.